Okay, I think first, Julian, would the self-intro, just your name and your position, what you're doing.
Julian Cribb, I'm a science writer and author.
Okay, great. First question, Julian. Can you explain the different facets of this perfect megastorm that humanity is facing, and what are the obstacles and consequences we have to deal with?
Well, we are facing a tremendous number of huge impacts that are coming down on us. We're destroying the Earth's biodiversity. We're wiping out other species at 30,000 a year is the rate. We're reaching the end of many of our key resources. We're risking great insecurity in the world's food supply. We're changing the world's climate. We are certainly at risk of epidemic or pandemic disease, much more than we were because we're moving diseases around the world. We're also contaminating the entire planet with chemicals that we manufacture in a way that has never happened in the past. I mean, every single human being is now contaminated. So all of these things are coming together at the same time, and that makes it a very large problem, a wicked problem. However, there are solutions for all of these things, but we have to take all of them into account, not just one at a time.
Yeah. It really seems that there is no cure-all to the world's problems, that it all comes back to one thing, overpopulation. We could have a technologically advanced society and run on biofuels indefinitely if there was only a couple of million people on the planet and not too much damage. So is overpopulation the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, and why don't people want to talk about it?
Well, people's reproductive right is a very sensitive issue. But at the moment, there is one very heartening statistic, and it is this. Around the world, whichever society you look at, whichever country you look at, young women are not getting married and they're not having babies. And if we allow young women to lead us, they will bring the world's population down gradually. From a peak of around about 10 or 11 billion in the 2060s, it could be 3 or 4 billion by 2130 or thereabouts. Now, the other thing that goes on at the moment that is making the population larger is the fact that we're living longer lives. So it's not just a matter of putting a condom on the whole world. You also have to deal with this increase in the number of older people in the world. And that's much less easy to deal with than contraception. I mean, presumably we're not going to advocate euthanasia or something like that. So, we're going to have to take the world through a period when our demand for all kinds of resources is going to peak. We're going to have to sustain the human population at around about 10 billion for a period of about 50 years. If we can get through that without a crash, then we'll have done pretty well.
I think so. Though raising living standards in third world countries is a proven way to reduce birth rates, I mean, do we have to be careful that we're not then creating more consumers, which then negates any gains we make in energy efficiency and environmental protection?
Well, we will always create more consumers. As we raise living standards everywhere, we are going to increase the amount of demand that the individual places on the planet. I mean, this is where the main issue is, that people, as they move to a higher living standard, an Australian living standard or an American living standard, just consume much more steel and coal and oil and all of those other things, and food. So unless we can actually limit our demand, and that's very, very hard to do in this consumer society, we are going to start pressurising all of those resources. But however, once the world population peaks out, then demand actually starts to come down quite quickly. I mean, there'll be no more need for mining in this world after about 2070, because all the minerals we will ever need will be in the waste stream, and we'll just simply be continually recycling aluminium, steel, titanium, whatever it is. So you can see that once we start to go on the downward slide, certain problems start to correct themselves.
Is the term sustainable growth an oxymoron?
If it refers to money, possibly not. You can grow your money infinitely because money actually doesn't exist. It's just a human idea, and we can make as much of it as we want, and we have a global financial crisis because we made too much of it, didn't we? And suddenly people lost confidence in it. If money were dematerialized, that is, if money was used on other things that do not consist of materials, such as human creativity, such as entertainment, such as software, such as books or plays or theatre, then you can spend as much money as you like on that because you're tapping something that is infinite, the human imagination. You're using an infinite amount of money. Only if you use money to destroy soil or water or mine the planet of any of its key resources do you have a real problem. So we just have to start recycling the material things and dematerialise the economy. That's the way to go.
Great. And what role, if any, do you think GMO foods will have in a post-peak oil and climatic unstable world? Will they be able to help feed the masses and save forests from destruction? And, are GMOs unhealthy and unsafe as many activists say they are?
Look, GM food is one tool in the agricultural toolbox. It's a screwdriver. It's not going to solve the problem. It offers some neat little solutions for some particular problems. But so far, it hasn't added 1 kilogram of extra food to the world's dinner plate. It will add some in time to come, but not a lot. So we are going to need other solutions to how we produce food than GM. If, as I expect, a lot of food will be produced in future in cities and in bioreactors and in algae farms and things like that, you probably won't need a lot of GM for that sort of food system.
Yeah. And can GMOs be farmed organically in the sense that free from fossil fuel pesticides and fertilisers?
The advantage of GM is that you can stack traits within a particular crop. So yes, you can stack pest resistance and weed resistance and things like that in a particular crop. So it could actually be used within an organic system. I realise it's contrary to the philosophy of organic farmers, but potentially, yes, it could be used to stop the amount of pollution that goes on with petrochemical pesticides.
And sort of help with climate change if the crops are more drought resistant and things like that.
Yes, but as I say, that's not the answer to climate change in the food sense. The answer to climate change in the food sense is to produce food in a way that is not dependent on the climate, i.e. in a city farm rather than a country farm.
Sure. Do you think the intellectual copywriting of life and food with GMOs is a problem? And should GMO technology be made, or safe GMO technology, be made open source to help farmers, humanity and the environment?
In the 1960s, India was starving, and the scientists who led the Green Revolution brought in the new high-yielding crop varieties, and they gave them free of charge to all the Indian farmers. And India was food self-sufficient within about 6 years. Now, if today you delivered those crop varieties and they were delivered by a big company that wanted to charge high prices for the seed, you would not end the starvation. That's an example of how the patenting of life can actually have a very pernicious effect. We've seen it with HIV drugs, that people who most needed those drugs because they came from poor countries couldn't get them. So very often, yes, unfortunately, any form of patenting or copywriting has the effect that it limits the number of people who can access the technology.
And whilst we're on the topic of food, I'll jump ahead to this question. What role do you think things like relocalisation, community gardens and permaculture have in teaching us how to transition to a low carbon and less consumptive world?
At the moment, most of the world's cities cannot feed themselves. They import nearly all of their food, some of it locally, some of it from a neighbouring country, and a lot of it from across the entire planet. And that's an unsustainable system. Sooner or later, we're going to see a city of 20 or 30 million people literally starve when the trucks and the planes and the ships don't get through. Maybe there's an oil crisis or a local war or something. So we will see happening in a big city what we already saw happen on the Sunshine Coast in Australia during the floods. That means the shops are empty within 48 hours and no more food after that. So I think that will shock people, and they will start to look for systems that can sustain food supplies within large cities, and that will involve the recycling of nutrients through things like algae farms and biocultures and hydroponics and aquaponics and things like that. Cities will produce an awful lot of their own food on the spot, and there will be less need to bring food from far away.
There's a great movement with permaculture called Permablitz, which is going around converting people's houses in suburbia to be, and their nature strips to grow food and be more self-sufficient.
We need to have a philosophy of permaculture applying to entire cities. So cities need to think in a permaculture. So they need to recycle their water, their nutrients, and their energy. If they can recycle all of those things, then you have the potential for a sustainable city.
One of the tenet things of permaculture is that within nature there's no waste.
Yes.
It's always recycled, but our system is constantly producing a lot of waste that we don't reuse.
Absolutely, and at the moment we throw half our food in the landfill. So half the efforts of our farmers and ag scientists are going in the landfill, and that's a really stupid waste. We're the first generation in the whole of human history to throw away up to half our food. Now, if we simply recycle the nutrients, instead of putting them in the landfill with all those toxic other things, and we simply recycle them through an algae farm, through hydroponics or composting or any of a dozen different ways, then we've got an eternal food supply.
Yeah.
We can keep on using it forever.
And so to add in something about the decentralisation of power, do you think that's going to be an important thing in the future? Because at the moment our power has to travel very, very far and long ways from your lawn or whatever. Wouldn't it be much more beneficial as a survival mechanism with what's coming if we were to decentralise the power when homes would create their own, just like we'll get them to create their own food, create their own power as well?
That's coming anyway. The Australian reported not long ago that coal companies were losing money because so many businesses in Australia have put solar panels on their roofs. I think one of the biggest developments we will see is algae farming. So we're using algae to turn sunlight into liquid transport fuels. At the moment we're importing $40 billion worth of fuel from Saudi Arabia. We could grow all of that. Every single litre of fuel we need in this country could be grown from an area no larger than one big sheep station. So using natural sunlight, I mean, that's the great asset, and we would produce fresh oil instead of fossil oil.
What's stopping us from doing that?
Only that it's a new industry and people are obviously feeling their way with some caution, but there are big investors behind it, and believe you me, it's going to happen.
Infinite growth on a finite planet is obviously impossible, and everyone, even politicians, everyone must know this. So what do you think are the obstacles stopping humanity from changing its suicidal course?
Well, hopefully we can start to bring the population down if we allow young women to do what young women are already doing. If we don't lecture them. I mean, young women are doing this autonomously without any reference to men. They're making the decision to reduce their fertility. We can have infinite growth of money because money is an infinite substance, provided we spend it on things that are also infinite, the things of the mind rather than material things.
Yeah.
And after that, we just have to recycle all those nutrients, all those metals, everything that we use once we can use again and again, and then we stop degrading the planet. So, if we can get a system where we recycle these things, and we can start to move to clean forms of energy like algae, which will produce liquid solar energy, and solar energy, wind, all the other types of energy, then yeah, we can be sustainable.
Because some people think technology is going to save us in the sense that, we'll move to another planet or we'll mine asteroids and things like that to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, I think that's a long way off in the future, and they're dwelling in a realm of science fiction.
Yeah.
What we now have to do is get the focus of public attention, investor interest, and R&D effort behind all of these new industries so that they become, we develop the sustainable society. At the moment, we're not paying enough attention to any of those things.
It really seems humanity is not going to stop using fossil fuels until they're gone or too expensive to extract. And even the greenest people I know still fly in jets on holidays and such. Do you honestly think humanity will stop using fossil fuels before it's too late? Or is a certain amount of drastic climate change now unstoppable? And should our governments and such be doing a lot more to prepare for our survival?
The biggest investors in algal oil are people like Boeing, Honeywell, the US Navy and Air Force, Etihad Airlines, Japan Airlines, Continental Airlines, Lufthansa. These people are putting their money into green fuel because they know they cannot rely on fossil fuel either in price or supply. I think it's only going to take another 1 or 2 oil shocks for everybody to say this fossil fuel is just not worth bothering with. I mean, if there is another bad oil shock like the 1970s, your supermarket bill could be driven to $500 to $1,000 per week. And I think enough people would be horrified, sufficiently horrified at that, to say, enough, we want to be protected against this unreliability.
And in one way, something like that would be good in a sense. It'll force people to start growing food locally.
All of those things. We transport food far too much, and of course we use unsustainable fuels to do so.
And on the topic of biofuel, I know Barack Obama was wanting the American military to have half the 50% of their fuel consumption running on biofuel, and you're saying, you know, isn't it a bit of an oxymoron just for an army to be calling themselves, you know, environmentally friendly because they're using biofuel?
Well, if you've got an army, I'd rather they were environmentally friendly than environmentally unfriendly. And of course, he is reacting to an even greater imperative, which is the next war could well be in the Middle East, and we don't want the fuel supply to be cut off, else we've got nothing to put on our jet fighters. So they are interested there from a point of view of strategic necessity.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And Australia should be too,
Yeah.
because we've got 23 days supply of oil in this country, and once it's gone, I mean, basically, petrol stations, if there was a crisis in the Middle East, petrol stations would start running out in Australia after 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, really quickly, and people panic buy like that straight away. On that topic of war, I think war is one of the biggest challenges facing us environmentally, because it really seems that no country can back down from this arms race and become an eco-friendly nation consuming less energy. Do you think we have any chance of becoming an environmentally friendly and sustainable world while nations still war with each other?
Yeah, I do. If you look at a map of the world and look where all the wars and conflicts have been over the last 30, 40 years, they have always been in countries which are food, land and water particularly insecure. Mm-hmm. If you can secure the food supply, so there's nothing for people to fight about, then you have a much greater chance of peace. Food wars are things like Rwanda, the genocide, Darfur, the Horn of Africa. Even the Balkans, there was a dispute over who got the river valley between the different ethnic groups that were contending. If there's enough to go round, it just lowers the tensions to the point where people don't actually fight. A lot of the tensions in the Middle East at the moment are due to the fact that they have grazed and farmed the countryside down to absolute ground zero.
So this Arab Spring, because we've been discussing this as well, one of the reasons behind the Arab Spring in Egypt and Syria and things is it comes down to...
The Egyptian government was brought down originally by women who were out there protesting over the price of food. And that protest grew into a protest against the whole government, and they tore down the government. Mm-hmm. And really, in history, we look back in history, the Russian Revolution began with a famine, the French Revolution began with a famine. You know, when people don't have enough to eat, they get bloody angry. You know, and the Spaniards have this wonderful saying, there are only 7 meals between civilization and anarchy. And it's time that our politicians absorbed the sense of that.
And a couple of questions to go.
Just going to make a little adjustment here.
You argue, and I think correctly, that the internet has given rise to a new global mind that could change things for the better. But I would add that the internet is a double-edged sword. Yes, it can give us access to useful information in an instant, but it is also very much full of untruths and biased opinions and advertisement, consumerism, propaganda, etc., as well as ever-popular conspiracy theories on the internet. David Suzuki recently wrote an article about the spread of internet conspiracy theories hindering environmental progress because lots of internet-savvy people think climate change is some new world order conspiracy, you know, being done by chemtrails or some other method. What are your thoughts on these pros and cons of the internet?
I think the internet is the most important evolutionary development in the whole of human history, because for the first time we are linking minds across cultures, across language groups, across society, around a whole planet, at light speed. So we're exchanging thoughts at the speed of light, and this is very like what happens in the mind of an embryo. When it's in the womb, in the second trimester, you start to get the axons and the glia and the neurons hooking up, and suddenly from a blob of cells, you have a sentient human being that's capable of thought and dreams and emotions and ideas. We're starting to think at a suprahuman level now. This is the very early stages. The thoughts are messy, uncoordinated. Yes, there's a lot of rubbish there, but there's a lot of rubbish in your own mind anyway. Whenever you have a big decision to make, you weigh all these different consequences, and some of them are trivial and some of them are important. Well, that's what we're doing at the moment. But I think we're seeing our governments immobilised by the scale of the problems and the challenges that humans are now facing. They can't solve these problems. They're like dinosaurs in a tar pit of opinion polls and vested interests. They can't move. What we're starting to see is consensuses forming around key issues around the world. and especially young people, are conversing with one another across all the old boundaries that used to divide human beings, across racial boundaries and religious boundaries and ethnic boundaries. So young people are picking up on this. They're learning to understand one another much more rapidly than the older generations ever did. I think the opportunity to form a planetary consensus on what to do about things like climate change, chemicalisation, food security, the possibility is there. Despite all the rubbish, there is a possibility of forming a consensus. And if you do form a consensus, you know, it may just be a large minority of the human population. There's no government, there's no religion, there's no corporation that would ignore that consensus. Yeah. You know, they would be driven by that consensus because it would be such a large group of the population. So in actual fact, oddly enough, I think one of the things that can save us is fashion. You know, it is trends in human thought. Yeah. You know, maybe if we all decide that we want to be a little less fertile, we want to eat a little more lightly, we want to be more careful in our consumption patterns so we don't pollute the planet or consume too many resources. If that becomes the fashion, then you know, you've got millions, even billions of people doing that. Yes, we can change things.
And the final question, when I speak to most people about the predicament humanity finds itself in with climate change and resource depletion, pollution, war, etc., most people say off camera that it's all going to end in a big disaster and we're not going to be able to make the big changes necessary because the system's so corrupt and entrenched. But on camera, people try to present a positive future and offer cures. But with this documentary, we don't want to offer people false hope. We want to present the stark and frightening realities of the dangers that we face and the hope of waking people up. So realistically, given everything we know, do you think humanity has any chance of survival, or are we part of the nature creating the mass extinction?
Every other creature that has ever gone into overpopulation and stressed its resources has had a population crash. So the possibility, the Peter Schnellenhuber scenario, where there'll be 1 billion or fewer human beings left, where 9 out of 10 of us will die over the next 100 years, is entirely possible. And we need to take it seriously, because otherwise, if we don't take it seriously, we won't do anything about it. But on the other hand, I think we will get some early warning shocks. We will see some cities starve. We will see some major famines. We'll see a few, you know, wars break out, possibly nuclear, and they will be the writing on the wall for all of us. And we will suddenly start to say, wow, if we don't pull back from the brink now, we're going over it like a batch of lemmings. You know, are we Homo sapiens or are we lemmings? You know, I think that we have got a long track record, a 2 million year track record in avoiding disaster. I think we have the brains to do it. Do we have the social structures? Do we have the cooperative ability? That remains to be seen.
It was interesting what we were talking about before we began the questions about this whole, when you said that was like 2 million years old, and it's all to do with, when you're referring about I'm trying to think how we can bring this into it, because it was an interesting topic about the monkeys. Doesn't matter. Unless you had something you could think of.
Well, I just say that human beings have been looking out for disaster for 2 million years. Ever since we were on the African savannah, we've been looking out for predators that might get us, bushfires, poisonous berries, whatever it is, we've been warning one another. We're always having this conversation about what are the dangers that are around us. I used to be a newspaper editor, and newspapers are full of this bad news. What we mean by that is, what are the risks, what are the threats, and how do we take them away? If we see a disease threat, we get our doctors to fix it, or our health system to fix it. You know, if we see a fire risk, we get our fire services to address it. So now we're starting to see global climatic risks, famine risks, and things like that. We are starting to realise we're going to have to work together as a species to solve these things, not as individual countries or nations or societies.
Brilliant, that's it. Thanks very much, Julian. That was fantastic.